everybody, welcome back. I'm Christina Wainwright, the branch manager at the Pacific Beach Library here in San Diego, and it's good to see you here at Tea with Jane Eyre. Today we have a lot to discuss. It's a short chapter, so we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about the chapter that we just finished with last week. Before we get started with that, though, it's always nice to have something to enjoy while you're having a discussion. So let's start with our tea. Today's tea is a loose leaf Earl Grey tea. I love Earl Grey tea, and especially I've seen several of you guys are drinking it, and I'm always kind of like, oh, I love that one. Why aren't I drinking Earl Grey today? So today, an Earl Grey loose leaf tea. This one is by Cafe Virtuoso. I've had this before too. I tried this the other day and it was so good. The only thing I had to be careful with is because I don't usually drink caffeinated teas, I drank a whole pot of it and I might have put a little too much tea inside, and so by the end of the afternoon I was like totally wired and like bouncing around, and it's just like, oh my goodness, it was a lot. But it was so good. I really like the taste of it. Hi Judy, hi Sandy, I see you guys there. I hope you guys are enjoying something delicious also. I do love an Earl Grey tea. It's just always so nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where we left off in Jane Eyre. Today we're going to be reading chapter 22, and chapter 21, a lot happened. For those of you who you may notice, my Masked Monday thing didn't work very well last week. We didn't get a lot of folks posting their photos, so I thought I'd show you this lovely Jane Eyre. She's wearing her mask today. If you would also like to post a photo in the comments of you wearing your mask, or perhaps somebody you know is wearing their mask, that would also be adorable. But yeah, here's Jane with her little mask. I was getting creative during break time, sorry. Okay, so going back to the story though. Things that we learned, things that were truths that were perhaps unmasked in chapter 21, let's say, were that Jane was called back to Gateshead Hall. And it was sort of a departure because we had been kind of progressing along through the story. She'd left Gateshead Hall. You might think that, it's totally in her past, that she'd gone to Lowood and now the next stage was Thornfield, and that that was a chapter of her past that was completely closed. But here it is, we see her again getting called back. And, ooh, some nice teas I see getting posted. We get called back to Gateshead Hall, and what we find there is that her cousin, John Reed, has passed away. He's become quite dissolute. He was drinking, he was gambling, he was losing a lot, and he was threatening his mother, and he'd altogether come to a pretty bad end, and he's passed away now. His mother, her health was destroyed by the stress of all this leading up to it, and then when she found out her son had died, she has basically a stroke. And so that's where we find her, is she's called back out to Jane that she wants to have some sort of resolution with her. And what we find out eventually when she gets there and Jane is able to speak with her aunt is that her aunt had hidden from Jane the knowledge that her uncle had come to see her 3 years prior, and he had inquired about Jane Eyre because he had made his fortune and he wanted to bestow it on Jane. And out of spite, her aunt had said, no, Jane Eyre died. She died at Lowood. And actually, she's quite upset that Jane did not have the courtesy to die at Lowood along with everyone else there who did. Aunt Reed, such a terrible person. And so, so Jane finds this letter given to her by her aunt from her uncle, and she reads it, and the aunt basically says, like, go do what you're going to do, admit expose me as the liar that I was, and, you've always been a cross for me to bear. You've always been terrible. And Jane still, with all of this, still says to her aunt, I give you my free forgiveness, and basically admits to her, like, I always just wanted you to like me. I always just wanted you to love me when I was a child. And she offers her her hand, she offers her cheek to kiss, and the aunt just turns away from her. And I thought it was beautiful how she said it. The way that Brontë describes it is that basically the aunt had lived her entire life hating Jane, and she could not change now. For to admit that Jane had actually not deserved that scorn and that treatment would be for the aunt to have to admit to herself that she had done wrong for all those years by this child. And so, again, it's a painful moment in the book, but it's kind of beautiful too, because Jane, is able to grow beyond the child that she'd been, just that feeling that passionate hatred and resentment, and able to see her aunt in a more charitable light and to be able to forgive her and to be able to move forward out of that past pain. And so it's a good moment. It's an important thing for Jane and her growth as a character. two little things I wanted to bring up, because again, this is a short chapter, so we have a little more time to talk today. The character of John Reed, I always thought on reading of it that that he was based on Branwell Brontë, who is the one brother amongst the Brontë children. And we talked about how the two eldest sisters had passed away at the school that was sort of similar to Lowood Institution. Then the three remaining sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, all became published authors. But Branwell was the one brother of the Brontë family, and he was the one who had also been an aspiring writer, who'd been an aspiring poet, who'd been a painter, and all these things, and never really amounted to much. He actually passed away after excessive drinking and opiate abuse in 1848, the year after Jane Eyre was published. And by many accounts, he was similar to John Reed at the end of his life, in the sense that he would go to his father and like threaten him that, you need to give me my money, and if you don't, I might hurt you or hurt myself. So again, very similar to what we see with John Reed saying to his mother, Sarah Reed. And so it's kind of interesting. I'll post a little link afterwards if you're interested in reading more about the origin of some of the characters. I've been hesitant to post a lot of things because there are spoilers sometimes. So this link that I found, it's to somebody's blog post where they're talking about the early chapters, the characters we meet in the first 4 chapters of the book. And so it includes John Reed and Sarah Reed and the different folks from Gateshead. So I think it's safe at this point because we know those characters and we shouldn't be getting too many spoilers. But if you haven't read the book yet, please resist the urge to go ahead and read the other installments on that blog thing. So I'll post that after our reading today. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, one other thing too, I just want to share because I love language and I think that a lot of you probably do too. I've heard it like a joke before about people, there's some words that you only hear paired in certain ways. For example, you have ruthless, but you never hear Ruth. And I just thought, I noticed it the other day when I was reading that there is actually an instance of Ruth, meaning to pity or compassion, again, the opposite of ruthless. And there's a moment when Jane talks about coming home to her aunt and she'd said, "I'd left this woman in bitterness and hate, and I came back to her now with no other emotion than a sort of ruth for her great sufferings." I just thought that was kind of fun. You don't get to see that very often. All right, the use of the word Ruth instead of ruthless. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with chapter 22 of Jane Eyre on Masked Monday. Let's go ahead and start. Chapter 22. Mr. Rochester had given me but 1 week's leave of absence, yet a month elapsed before I quitted Gateshead. I wished to leave immediately after the funeral, but Georgiana entreated me to stay till she could get off to London, whither she was now at last invited by her uncle, Mr. Gibson, who had come down to direct his sister's interment, and to settle the family affairs. Georgiana said she dreaded being left alone with Eliza. From her she got neither sympathy in her dejection, support in her fears, nor aid in her preparations. So I bore with her feeble-minded quailings and selfish lamentations as well as I could, and did my best in sewing for her and packing her dresses. It is true that while I worked she would idle, and I thought to myself, if you and I were destined to live always together, cousin, we would commence matters on a different footing. I should not settle tamely down into being the forbearing party. I should assign you your share of labor and compel you to accomplish it, or else it should be left undone. I should insist also on your keeping some of those drawling, half-insincere complaints hushed in your own breast. It is only because our connection happens to be very transitory and comes at a peculiarly mournful season that I consent thus to render it so patient and compliant on my part. At last I saw Georgiana off, but now it was Eliza's turn to request me to stay another week. Her plans required all her time and attention, she said. She was about to depart for some unknown bourne, and all day long she stayed in her own room, her door bolted within, filling trunks, emptying drawers, burning papers, and holding no communication with anyone else. She wished me to look after the house, to see callers, and answer notes of condolence. One morning she told me I was at liberty. And, she added, I am obliged to you for your valuable services and discreet conduct. There is some difference between living with such a one as you and with Georgiana. You perform your own part in life and burden no one. Tomorrow, she continued, I set out for the continent. I shall take up my abode in a religious house near Lisle? A nunnery, you would call it. There I shall be quiet and unmolested. I shall devote myself for a time to the examination of the Roman Catholic dogmas and to a careful study of the workings of their system. If I find it to be, as I half suspect it is, the one best calculated to ensure the doing of all things decently and in order, I shall embrace the tenets of Rome and probably take the veil. I neither expressed surprise at this resolution nor attempted to dissuade her from it. The vocation will fit you to a hair, I thought. Much good may it do you. When we parted, she said, "Goodbye, cousin Jane Eyre. I wish you well. You have some sense." I then returned, "You are not without sense, cousin Eliza, but what you have, I suppose, in another year will be walled up alive in a French convent. However, it is not my business, and so it suits you, I don't much care." "You are in the right," said she, and with these words we each went our separate way. As I shall not have occasion to refer either to her or her sister again, I may as well mention here that Georgiana made an advantageous match with a wealthy, worn-out man of fashion, and that Eliza actually took the veil, and is at this day superior of the convent where she passed the period of her novitiate, and which she endowed with her fortune. How people feel when they are returning home after an absence, long or short, I did not know. I had never experienced the sensation. I had known what it was to come back to Gateshead when a child after a long walk, to be scolded for looking cold or gloomy, and later what it was to come back from church to Lowood, to long for a plenteous meal and a good fire, and to be unable to get either. Neither of these returnings were very pleasant or desirable. No magnet drew me to a given point, increasing in its strength of attraction the nearer I came. The return to Thornfield was yet to be tried. My journey seemed tedious, very tedious. 50 miles one day, a night spent at an inn, 50 miles the next day. During the first 12 hours I thought of Mrs. Reed in her last moments. I saw her disfigured and discolored face, and heard her strangely altered voice. I mused on the funeral day, the coffin, the hearse, the black train of tenants and servants. Few was the number of relatives, the gaping vault, the silent church, the solemn service. Then I thought of Eliza and Georgiana. I beheld one, the cynosure of a ballroom, the other, the inmate of a convent cell, and I dwelt on and analyzed their separate peculiarities of person and character. The evening arrival of the great town of scattered these thoughts. Night gave them quite another turn. Laid down on my traveler's bed, I left reminiscence for anticipation. I was going back to Thornfield, but how long was I to stay there? Not long, of that I was sure. I had heard from Mrs. Fairfax in the interim of my absence. The party at the hall was dispersed. Mr. Rochester had left for London 3 weeks ago, but he was then expected to return in a fortnight. Mrs. Fairfax surmised that he was gone to make arrangements for his wedding, as he had talked of purchasing a new carriage. She said the idea of his marrying Miss Ingram still seemed strange to her, but from what everybody said, and from what she had herself seen, she could no longer doubt that the event would shortly take place. "You would be strangely incredulous if you did doubt it," was my mental comment. I don't doubt it. The question followed, where was I to go? I dreamed of Miss Ingram all the night. In a vivid morning dream, I saw her closing the gates of Thornfield against me and pointing me out another road, and Mr. Rochester looked on, with his arms folded, smiling sardonically, as it seemed, at both her and me. I had not notified to Mrs. Fairfax the exact day of my return, for I did not wish either car or carriage to meet me at Millcote. I proposed to walk the distance quietly by myself, and very quietly, after leaving my box in the hostler's care, did I slip away from the George Inn, about 6 o'clock of a June evening, and take the old road to Thornfield, a road which lay chiefly through fields and was now little frequented. It was not a bright or splendid summer evening, though fair and soft. The haymakers were at work all along the road, and the sky, though far from cloudless, was such as promised well for the future. Its blue, where blue was visible, was mild and settled, and its cloud strata high and thin. The west, too, was warm. No watery gleam chilled it. It seemed as if there was a fire lighted, an altar burning behind its screen of marbled vapor, and out of apertures shone a golden redness. I felt glad as the road shortened before me, so glad that I stopped once to ask myself what that joy meant, and to remind reason that it was not to my home I was going, or to a permanent resting place, or to a place where fond friends looked out for me and awaited my arrival. Mrs. Fairfax will smile you a calm welcome, to be sure, said I, and little Adele will clap her hands and jump to see you. But you know very well you are thinking of another than they, and that he is not thinking of you. But what is so headstrong as youth? What so blind as inexperience? Those affirmed that it was pleasure enough to have the privilege of again looking on Mr. Rochester, whether he looked on me or not, and they added, "Hasten, hasten, be with him while you may, but a few more days or weeks at most, and you are parted from him forever." And then I strangled a newborn agony, a deformed thing which I could not persuade myself to own and rear, and ran on. They are making hay too in Thornfield Meadows, or rather the laborers are just quitting their work and returning home with their rakes on their shoulders now at the hour I arrive. I have but a field or two to traverse, and then I shall cross the road and reach the gates. How full the hedges are of roses, but I have no time to gather any. I want to be at the house. I pass the tall briar, shooting leafy and flowery branches across the path. I see the narrow stile with stone steps, and I see Mr. Rochester sitting there, a book and pencil in his hand. He is writing. Well, he is not a ghost, yet every nerve I have is unstrung. For a moment I am beyond my own mastery. What does it mean? I did not think I should tremble in this way when I saw him, or lose my voice or the power of motion in his presence. I will go back as soon as I can stir. I need not make an absolute fool of myself. I know another way to the house. It does not signify if I knew 20 ways, for he has seen me. "Hello," he cries, and he puts up his book and his pencil. "There you are. Come on, if you please." I suppose I do come on, though in what fashion I know not, being scarcely cognizant of my movements and solicitous only to appear calm, and above all to control the working muscles of my face, which I feel rebel insolently against my will, and struggle to express what I had resolved to conceal. But I have a veil, it is down. I may make shift yet to behave with decent composure. "And this is Jane Eyre. Are you coming from Millcote, and on foot? Why, yes, just one of your tricks. Not to send for a carriage and come clattering over street and road like a common mortal, but to steal into the vicinage of your home along with twilight, just as if you were a dream or a shade. What the deuce have you done with yourself this last month?" "I have been with my aunt, sir, who is dead." "A true Janian reply. Good angels be my guard. She comes from the other world, from the abode of people who are dead, and tells me so when she meets me alone here in the gloaming. If I dared, I'd touch you, to see if you are substance or shadow, you elf. But I'd as soon offer to take hold of a blue ignis fatuus light in a marsh. Truant, truant," he added, when he had paused an instant. "Absent from me a whole month, and forgetting me quite, I'll be sworn." I knew there would be pleasure in meeting my master again, even though broken by the fear that he was so soon to cease to be my master, and by the knowledge that I was nothing to him. But there was ever in Mr. Rochester, so at least I thought, such a wealth of the power of communicating happiness, that to taste but of the crumbs he scattered to stray and stranger birds like me was to feast genially. His last words were balm. They seemed to imply that it imported something to him whether I forgot him or not. And he had spoken of Thornfield as my home. Would that it were my home. He did not leave the stile, and I hardly liked to ask to go by. I inquired soon if he had not been to London. "Yes, I suppose you found that out by a second sight?" Mrs. Fairfax told me in a letter. "And did she inform you what I went to do?" "Oh, yes, sir. Everybody knew your errand." "You must see the carriage, Jane, and tell me if you don't think it will suit Mrs. Rochester exactly, and whether she won't look like Queen Boadicea, leaning back against those purple cushions. I wish, Jane, I were a trifle better adapted to match with her externally. Tell me now, fairy as you are, can't you give me a charm or a philter or something of that sort to make me a handsome man?" "It would be past the power of magic, sir." And in thought I added, "A loving eye is all the charm needed. To such you are handsome enough, or rather your sternness has a power beyond beauty." Mr. Rochester had sometimes read my unspoken thoughts with an acumen to me incomprehensible. In the present instance he took no notice of my abrupt vocal response, but he smiled at me with a certain smile he had of his own, and which he used but on rare occasions. He seemed to think it too good for common purposes. It was the real sunshine of feeling. He shed it over me now. "Pass, Janet," said he, making room for me to cross the stile. "Go up home and stay your weary little wandering feet at a friend's threshold." All I had now to do was to obey him in silence. No need for me to colloquize further. I got over the stile without a word and meant to leave him calmly. An impulse held me fast. A force turned me round. I said, or something in me said for me, and in spite of me, "Thank you, Mr. Rochester, for your great kindness. I am strangely glad to get back again to you, and wherever you are is my home, my only home." I walked on so fast that even he could hardly have overtaken me had he tried. Little Adele was half wild with delight when she saw me. Mrs. Fairfax received me with her usual plain friendliness. Leah smiled, and even Sophie bid me bonsoir, good evening, with glee. This was very pleasant. There is no happiness like that of being loved by our fellow creatures and feeling like your presence is an addition to their comfort. I that evening shut my eyes resolutely against the future. I stopped my ears against the voice that kept warning me of near separation and coming grief. When tea was over, and Mrs. Fairfax had taken her knitting, and I had assumed a low seat near her, and Adele, kneeling on the carpet, had nestled close up to me, and a sense of mutual affection seemed to surround us with a ring of golden peace, I uttered a silent prayer that we might not be parted far or soon. But when, as we thus sat, Mr. Rochester entered, unannounced, and looking at us, seemed to take pleasure in the spectacle of a group so amicable. When he said he supposed the old lady was all right now that she had got her adopted daughter back again, and added that he saw Adele was prête à croquer sa petite maman anglaise, ready to devour her little English mamma. I half ventured to hope that he would, even after his marriage, keep us together somewhere under the shelter of his protection, and not quite exiled from the sunshine of his presence. A fortnight of dubious calm succeeded my return to Thornfield Hall. Nothing was said of the master's marriage, and I saw no preparation going on for such an event. Almost every day I asked Mrs. Fairfax if she had yet heard anything decided. Her answer was always in the negative. Once she said she had actually put the question to Mr. Rochester as to when he was going to bring his bride home, but he had answered her only by a joke and one of his queer looks, and she could not tell what to make of him. One thing specially surprised me, and that was there were no journeyings backward and forward, no visits to Ingram Park. To be sure, it was 20 miles off, on the borders of another county, but what was that distance to an ardent lover? To so practiced and indefatigable a horseman as Mr. Rochester, it would be but a morning's ride. I began to cherish hopes I had no right to conceive, that the match was broken off, that rumor had been mistaken, that one or both parties had changed their minds. I used to look at my master's face to see if it were sad or fierce, but I could not remember the time when it had been so uniformly clear of clouds or evil feelings. If, in the moments I and my pupil spent with him, I lacked spirits and sunk into inevitable dejection, he became even gay. Never had he called me more frequently to his presence, never been kinder to me when there, and alas, never had I loved him so well. Poor Jane. Okay, that concludes chapter 22 of Jane Eyre. Tomorrow is another short chapter, but it's a good one. I'll see you then. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining me for tea with Jane Eyre. Bye!